Welcome to AEDT 4120, Serious Gaming and Simulations. Week 6, Serious Games Design, video clip 3 of 4. I'm Professor Bill Kapralos, and over the next few minutes we'll be continuing our discussion on designing games as learning tools. This is part 3 of 4. However, prior to doing so, here's the list of analysis questions for this particular video clip. Number 1. What is the importance of understanding your player or user? Number 2. How do we select a game genre or a game style? And finally, number 3. What is wrong with using a checklist for designing enjoyable educational experiences? In this video clip and in the next, we will begin by looking at the actual design decisions that you need to take when developing a serious game or a simulation. And we begin in this video clip with what I believe is the most important aspect of designing any sort of educational application, and that is the player, or in other words, your intended audience. Most learners will be excited when they hear that you are developing a serious game for them. But many of them may also be quite skeptical, given that there's so much learning that is quite boring, and people need to be clear that the game is being made to engage them and that they will have a say in its design. It's actually quite important from my own experience that you do meet with the audience and obtain their input. Ultimately, the audience will quickly determine whether the game is engaging, and if not, they will simply throw it away and not play it. And you certainly don't want to waste your time and money, so it is best to consider your audience. In order to develop an understanding of your player or your intended audience, it will imply that you'll have to study your audience. And this is typically done by selecting a representative group that you can work with. Typically, audiences are reasonably homogeneous, for example, medical students, firefighters, surgeons, and this simplifies matters considerably because then your representative group will be a very good representation of the group at large. Some audiences, however, are far more diverse, making it a difficult task to choose a representative group to work with. The following variables are amongst the most important to consider: age, gender, competitiveness, and previous experience with a game. And these are actually very important factors. When we consider age, for example, a game that will appeal to a 5-year-old may not necessarily appeal to a 15-year-old or a 30-year-old. Similarly, there are many differences with respect to gender and games. Developing an understanding of your player or your intended audience may involve spending a considerable amount of time with your representative group that you're working with. For example, Breakaway Games developed 24 Blue, a serious game aimed at aircraft carrier flight deck operations and safety education and training. During the design process, Breakaway sent their entire design team onto an active aircraft carrier for 1 week, and during this week, the designers lived on the aircraft carrier. The design team saw and experienced firsthand life on an aircraft carrier, whether it be the launching or the landing of aircraft to preparing a meal in the kitchen. During this time, the designers also had the chance to photograph the environment, which they used later on in the development of their game, and to interview various members of the aircraft carrier. If your audience does happen to be diverse, then there are a number of suggested guidelines that you can follow. Number 1, seek a lowest common denominator game style, such as a game format that appeals to both men and women, or both to competitive or non-competitive people. For example, if your audience includes men and women, then first-person shooter may not necessarily be your best choice. Potential game formats that serve this purpose includes detective games, adventure and puzzle games, and strategy-type games. Number 2, create more than one game. For example, one competitive game and one more competitive game if your audience includes those that have a competitive nature versus those that don't. As an example, consider the company Games to Train. They created a template in which the user could choose from 8 different games to learn the same content. So now all of a sudden they gave their users choice, one of 8 choices, and it was up to the user to choose the best genre or the best style of game. Now, of course, this does increase your development time and costs. Finally, number 3, provide a non-game alternative for those in the audience who are not engaged by the game you choose. you may discover that there are members of your intended audience that don't appeal to gaming at all, and in this case, offering them a non-game choice may be advantageous. Of course, there are some problems with such approaches. For example, if we choose a game with the lowest common denominator, then we run the risk of involving too much compromise and therefore developing a game that doesn't please anyone. When we offer our audience choice in game style or game genre, then that obviously increases our development costs, as previously mentioned. And of course, it's very important to get representatives of the audience involved early on in the design process. Consider conducting focus group sessions, informal interviews, and including audience members on your design team. This will be discussed in greater detail when we outline instructional design. Let's examine selecting a particular game style or a game genre. Basically, when you're designing a serious game, all standard game genres can be used. This includes action, adventure, fighting, puzzle games, role-playing games, simulation-type games, sports, and strategy games. How do you actually go about selecting a game style or a genre? Well, there may be a commercial game that you're already aware of that immediately makes sense in terms of the content. So it's best not to stop with games you know, but look at a wide variety of options. Speak with plenty of gamers. They can provide some great insight. And of course, remember that the reason hit games are good models is that their gameplay is proven. In other words, a game that is successful because of its good gameplay, and therefore using this as a model always makes sense. But of course, you can still create an entirely new game from scratch and combine gameplay elements from many other types of games. Let's examine game elements, and more specifically, are there common game elements that serious games must contain? Well, according to Tom Malone in 1981, author of What Makes Computer Games Fun, he suggested a checklist for designing enjoyable educational experiences, and his checklist consists of 3 elements: challenge, fantasy, and curiosity. In other words, every learning game or serious game must include these 3. Similarly, Robert Ehlers and Rosemary Garris from the United States Navy, they defined critical characteristics for fun, learning, and gameplay as follows: an imaginary situation, rule-governed goals must be specified, competitive and cooperative, progressive difficulty, sound effects, dynamic graphics, user control, outcome uncertainty, simulated danger, performance feedback, high response rates, and informational complexity. Every good serious game does include many of these aspects, but having all these aspects doesn't necessarily mean it's a good serious game or an effective serious game. In other words, it could be problematic when you simply define a list of game elements and such an element approach, where you develop a game such that it must contain a specific list of elements. Although such elements are found in good games, just having a list of elements doesn't imply you will have a good game. A better approach, in contrast to such an element approach, is to look at good games and try to capture their style of putting the elements together. And of course, you should consider many options. The type of game you choose and your skill in integrating it with learning will determine the level of engagement. This brings us to the end of our discussion on designing games as learning tools, part 3. I just want to point you to a brief video available from the Breakaway Games website. This video briefly describes the serious game 24 Blue along with its design, and it's worth looking at. This brings us to our list of analysis questions. Number 1. Suppose you had to develop a serious game for diabetes numeracy training for adolescents. What game genre would you choose and why? Number 2. Suppose you had to develop that same serious game for diabetes numeracy training for adolescents. What game elements from those discussed in this video clip would you include and why? This brings us to the end of this video clip. Thank you.